At 11:58 p.m., the digital notification lit up my screen. An email containing a temporary restraining order. Julian's attached message was brief. Do not contact me again. I need to feel safe. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my laptop. I instantly identified this as a calculated legal shield designed to erase the $8,000 debt he owed me. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. Have you ever had someone weaponize your kindness against you? Drop a comment below. I'm reading every single story. My reaction wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. The moment I read Julian's restraining order, my mind shifted into its natural state, architecture. I build software systems for a living. I identify bugs, secure vulnerabilities, and map out logical pathways. Julian thought a restraining order would induce panic. He expected a frantic barrage of text messages, desperate phone calls, and emotional voicemails begging for an explanation. He was banking on my emotional unraveling to prove to a judge that I was the unstable one. But I gave him absolutely nothing. No texts, no calls, no reaction. This is the strategy of strategic silence. When dealing with a manipulative person, silence is never surrender. It is a tactical retreat to higher ground. By denying Julian the reaction he desperately craved, I deprived him of the ammunition he needed to sustain his narrative as a victim. I became a total ghost. Instead of reaching for my phone to confront him, I reached for my external hard drive. I treated his betrayal not as a heartbreak, but as a forensic project. At exactly 12 a.m., mere minutes after receiving the email, I began exporting our entire digital history. Every transaction, every email, every text message spanning the last 2 years. I categorized them by date, subject, and financial value. Our relationship was no longer a romance. It was an audit. I downloaded the PDF receipts of the loan agreements we had drawn up. I tracked the flow of my money from my checking account directly into his business accounts. I didn't feel sadness as I watched the numbers add up. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. Julian had underestimated the very trait he used to mock. He always said I was too cold, too analytical, too obsessed with data. He was about to learn exactly what happens when that data is weaponized. I worked relentlessly through the night, cross-referencing timestamps and IP addresses. My silence was the canvas, and the data was the paint. Let him sit in his apartment, refreshing his phone, waiting for the frantic text that would never come. Let him build his false sense of security. While he was sleeping, I was compiling a legally bulletproof dossier of his extortion. I didn't need to ask him why he did it. The spreadsheets told the entire story, laying bare a timeline of calculated manipulation that ended with a fraudulent legal filing. By dawn, the architecture of his lie was fully mapped out on my dual monitors. My eyes were burning and my hands were shaking from the caffeine and sheer adrenaline, but the clarity of the evidence kept me anchored. It wasn't about being heartless, it was about the survival instinct kicking in. To understand the true depth of Julian's calculated fraud, you have to understand the business transaction we called a relationship. For 2 years, I had been the silent investor in his version of a life. Julian was a creative consultant, a title that essentially meant he generated a lot of ideas but very little revenue. When he needed high-end rendering equipment for his studio, I funded it. When his commercial rent was short, I covered the gap. The $8,000 wasn't a spontaneous gift. It was a meticulously documented loan, explicitly intended to keep his struggling business afloat during a dry spell. But the moment I asked for a return on my investment, the narrative instantly shifted. Whenever I requested a payment plan or a definitive timeline, he branded my requests as controlling. This is the weaponization of victimhood. Manipulators like Julian use their perceived vulnerability as an impenetrable shield against accountability. They twist perfectly reasonable boundaries into acts of unprovoked aggression. If I asked for my money back, I was suffocating his creative process. If I pointed out his broken financial promises, I was being emotionally abusive and unsupportive. He needed to be the victim because the alternative was admitting he was a parasite. I had footed the bill for his lifestyle, functioning as a premium subscription service he could tap into whenever his funds ran critically low. Looking at the master spreadsheets I had built by 4 a.m., the pattern was clinical, predictable, and undeniable. He had meticulously drained my resources, and the restraining order was simply his final, desperate exit strategy. He knew the debt was coming due in full, so he manufactured a crisis to cast me as a threat. If I was legally forbidden from contacting him, the $8,000 would simply vanish into the ether, written off as the cost of escaping an allegedly toxic partner. It was a brilliant, sociopathic gambit, but it relied on one fatal miscalculation. He assumed I would crumble under the weight of legal intimidation. He assumed my previous kindness equated to permanent weakness, but my kindness had a strict limit, and my analytical mind had taken the wheel. I printed out the final stacks of paper as the sun began to rise over the city skyline. I had a complete, chronological accounting of his financial parasitism. Every time he had called me controlling, every time he had played the traumatized, struggling artist, it was all documented alongside the corresponding bank transfers. I wasn't just going to prove he owed me money. I was going to mathematically prove that his entire victim identity was a meticulously crafted fraud. Julian didn't just want to erase his debt. He wanted to dismantle my credibility entirely, striking at the foundation of my independence. At 9 a.m. the following morning, I received a calendar invite from the Human Resources Department at my software firm. The subject line simply read, "Urgent check-in." When I logged into the virtual meeting, the Director of Human Resources and my department head were waiting. Their faces were grim, their postures stiff. They informed me that an individual named Julian had forwarded a copy of a temporary restraining order to the company's general inbox. While company policy typically requires a neutral investigation before action, Julian's email explicitly claimed that my professional duties provided me with the means and opportunity to stalk him, forcing their hand to mitigate liability. This wasn't just a personal complaint. It was framed as a direct security breach, which is why they were obligated to act immediately. He had attached a lengthy, fabricated email claiming I was unstable, dangerous, and a massive liability to the workplace. He formally requested that I be restricted from accessing the building, citing his own safety, despite the fact that he didn't even work there and had no business with our firm. It was a direct, calculated strike at my career, his attempt to sever my primary source of income and stability. The Human Resources Director, looking deeply uncomfortable, informed me that strict company policy required them to place me on immediate administrative leave while they investigated the matter. Julian wanted me panicked, humiliated, and financially crippled. He wanted to watch my professional life burn to the ground, so I would be too weak to fight him in court. But I didn't break. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was a perfectly calibrated machine. I looked directly into my webcam and asked them to give me exactly 5 minutes. I didn't plead my case with tears. I didn't offer emotional defenses or beg for their understanding. I offered documentation. I immediately shared my screen and opened the secure cloud folder I had built overnight. I walked my leadership team through the precise timeline of events. I showed them the signed loan agreements, the Venmo receipts, and the exact date the $8,000 debt became due. Then, I showed them the timestamp of Julian's restraining order request, filed a mere 12 hours after my final demand for payment. I presented the data clinically, stripping away the romance and exposing the raw extortion. I explained that Julian was weaponizing a legal statute to commit financial fraud and that his email to the company was a textbook act of tortious interference with my employment. My department head, a man who built his entire career on logic and data analysis, immediately recognized the pattern. The Human Resources Director's expression shifted rapidly from uncomfortable pity to professional outrage. They saw the transaction for exactly what it was. My administrative leave lasted exactly 25 minutes. By the end of the meeting, the firm's leadership assured me I was fully supported and instructed me to return to my projects. Julian's escalation had completely failed. He had tried to burn my professional reputation, but all he had done was provide me with documented proof of his malice. With my career secured, it was time to initiate the professional escalation. By noon, I was sitting across a polished oak desk from Sarah, a civil litigation attorney who specialized in dismantling fraudsters. I handed her my meticulously organized binders. She spent an hour reviewing the timelines, the bank transfers, and the printed copy of Julian's email to my Human Resources Department. When she looked up, her smile was razor sharp. Within another hour, Sarah was drafting our response. We weren't just going to defend against the temporary restraining order. We were going to obliterate it. We filed an aggressive counterclaim for the original $8,000, plus extensive punitive damages for tortious interference with my employment and blatant defamation. While Sarah built our legal siege, I maintained absolute radio silence online. I became a ghost on all social media platforms. I didn't post vague quotes about betrayal. I didn't block him, which would have signaled an emotional reaction. I simply ceased to exist in his digital world. Julian, however, took the exact opposite approach. Assuming he had won, he began his public performance. He posted melancholic updates about surviving toxic environments and finding peace after chaos. He played the traumatized victim to his audience, soaking up their sympathy and validation, completely unaware of the legal avalanche moving steadily toward him. This dynamic exposes the narcissistic injury of accountability. Narcissists rely on a constant, uninterrupted stream of validation to uphold their false self-image. When they are confronted with objective, documented truth that contradicts their victim narrative, they don't just feel guilty, they feel mortally threatened. Their ego sustains an injury that cannot be healed by simple apologies or deflections. Julian was publicly reinforcing his delusion because his fragile ego demanded an audience to survive the reality of his own actions. But the court of public opinion is entirely irrelevant when the court of law requires receipts. Every single post he made about his supposed trauma was another piece of evidence. Sarah calmly downloaded and added to our file, highlighting his manipulative public persona. He was so confident in his ability to spin reality that he forgot the golden rule of accounting. The numbers always balance in the end. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. By starving him of a reaction, I forced him to overplay his hand. He was fighting a shadow, swinging wildly at an opponent who had already left the ring and walked straight into the courthouse. I went to sleep that night feeling nothing but cold, absolute clarity. The legal machinery was in motion, the traps were set, and my silence was deafening. This wasn't revenge. It was a balance sheet, and I was about to collect. The discovery phase of our lawsuit yielded what Sarah clinically referred to as the kill shot. We had subpoenaed Julian's bank records to trace the exact flow of the $8,000. We wanted to prove he had the liquid funds to repay me and was actively choosing fraud instead. But when Sarah reviewed the line item transactions, she found something far more lethal than simple debt evasion. Julian hadn't just refused to pay me back. He had been quietly draining me in ways I hadn't even noticed. Buried deep in the metadata of his financial statements were unauthorized payments to his private creditors. By cross-referencing the merchant category codes and the specific IP addresses used for these transactions, we proved these weren't legitimate business expenses, but manual entries initiated from Julian's own home network to his personal bank accounts. It was a digital fingerprint that tied him directly to the theft. He had used my stored credit card credentials to pay down 3 of his own maxed-out credit cards. The charges had been cleverly disguised under the names of software, subscriptions, and digital assets for his creative studio. Charges I had assumed were just standard business expenses I had previously agreed to cover. The total amounted to an additional $4,500. My vision narrowed as I looked at the highlighted spreadsheet in Sarah's office. This was no longer just a civil dispute over an unpaid loan or a petty defamation case. Julian had crossed a hard, definitive line. It was documented. Undeniable wire fraud and identity theft. The temporary restraining order he had filed to protect himself was now the very thing that had triggered a forensic investigation into his criminal behavior. If he had just paid me back, or even just walked away, his unauthorized charges might have remained buried in my auto-pay statements for years. But his staggering arrogance had triggered an audit. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was a sharp, focused laser. We immediately amended our counterclaim. Sarah didn't mince words in her legal filings. We outlined the exact dates, IP addresses, and routing numbers associated with the fraudulent charges. We prepared to present this evidence not just to the civil judge, but potentially to the district attorney. Julian had tried to paint me as an unhinged stalker to mask the fact that he was a common thief. The beauty of digital currency is that it leaves an indelible footprint. He could delete text messages, he could lie to his friends, and he could post endless stories about his trauma, but he could not rewrite the ledger of a federally insured bank. The trap he had set for me had snapped shut on his own ankle. The architecture of his lie was crumbling, crushed under the weight of his own greed. He thought he was playing a game of emotional manipulation, but he had unwittingly entered a game of forensic accounting. We were fully armed, and we were ready for court. Because we filed an emergency motion to dissolve the restraining order alongside a complaint for fraud, We secured an expedited court hearing within 3 weeks, a rare but necessary win given the documented evidence of perjury. The air conditioning in the courthouse was aggressive, but my pulse was steady. I sat beside Sarah at the plaintiff's table, my posture rigid, my expression completely blank. Julian sat 2 tables away, wearing a tailored suit that I had probably paid for. When the judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for nonsense, called our case, Julian immediately launched into his performance. He spoke softly, his voice trembling at all the right intervals. He told the judge that I was obsessively tracking him, that my demands for repayment were actually thinly veiled attempts to control his life, and that he desperately needed the restraining order to feel safe. He played the victim with practiced perfection. Then it was Sarah's turn. She didn't argue. She didn't match his emotional tone. She simply placed our massive indexed binders on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, my client has not contacted the petitioner since the order was filed," Sarah stated clearly. "However, we have a motion to dissolve this order immediately, accompanied by a counterclaim for $12,500. Sarah opened the first binder. She walked the judge through the timeline of the loan, presenting the signed agreements and the exact date Julian defaulted. Then she pulled out the kill shot. She presented the bank records proving Julian's unauthorized use of my credit card credentials. She handed the judge the IP logs showing the fraudulent payments originating directly from Julian's personal devices. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The judge reviewed the documents in absolute silence. Julian's performance evaporated instantly. The color drained from his face as he realized his financial autopsy was sitting on the judge's desk. The judge looked up, his eyes locking onto Julian with pure disdain. "You filed a sworn affidavit claiming you were in fear for your safety," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel striking wood. "But the evidence suggests you weaponized the court's time to evade a documented debt and conceal active financial fraud." The judge didn't just dissolve the temporary restraining order. He issued a blistering warning about the severe penalties for perjury and filing false police reports. He immediately granted my full judgment for the entire $12,500, plus all of my attorney's fees, and tacked on maximum punitive damages for his emails to my employer. Julian sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed reality completely shattered. The transaction was complete. The audit was closed. I didn't smile. I just packed my laptop into my briefcase and walked out of the courtroom, leaving him to face the ruins of his own design. The fallout was swift, brutal, and clinically efficient. Within a week, Sarah served Julian's few remaining clients with wage garnishment orders. His bank accounts were frozen to satisfy the massive judgment against him. Because we had a court-ordered finding of fraud, the bankruptcy protections he desperately tried to file were completely nullified. He could not erase the debt. His professional reputation, built entirely on networking, charm, and the illusion of success, dissolved the exact moment the garnishment notices hit his clients' desks. The creative studio he had funded with my money collapsed. He lost his income, his carefully curated social status, and ultimately, his apartment. I returned to my software firm without missing a beat. My career continued on its upward trajectory, completely untouched by his pathetic attempts to sabotage it. My colleagues never mentioned the incident again, treating it with the professional distance it required. I went back to building systems, identifying bugs, and ensuring secure architecture. The silence in my apartment was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a sudden betrayal. It was the clean, quiet hum of order restored. I didn't feel the need to celebrate. There was no joy in destroying Julian. There was only the deep satisfaction of balancing the equation. It wasn't about watching him fall. It was about ensuring that his cycle of exploitation was finally broken, so he couldn't do this to anyone else. Justice is not revenge. It is the restoration of order. I had learned a permanent, undeniable lesson about the mechanics of trust and the absolute necessity of proof. I've come to realize that keeping a meticulous record of your life isn't about paranoia. It is the only insurance policy you have against those who try to rewrite reality to serve their own narratives. We want to believe that love and loyalty are enough to protect us, but manipulative people rely on that exact sentiment to exploit our blind spots. They count on us being too emotional, too forgiving, and too embarrassed to treat their betrayal like the crime it actually is. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. And true freedom means recognizing that your boundaries are only as strong as your willingness to enforce them. I had to forgive myself for ignoring the red flags, for funding my own exploitation, and for believing that my kindness would eventually be reciprocated. Healing didn't come from Julian's ruin. It came from the absolute certainty that I would never allow myself to be a silent investor in my own destruction again. The cold, methodical retaliation was simply the necessary surgery to cut out the infection. Now, I am whole, protected by the very armor I was once told made me too cold. If this story helped you realize that your silence is actually your biggest weapon, share it with someone who needs the strength to set their own boundary. Don't let them silence you. Subscribe for more stories of justice.